Good evening. Welcome to UST, Jones Hall. This is the second speakers event in the MLA and Integrated Humanities speaker series. And I'm Dr. Tom Baer, Director of the MLA and of Integrated Humanities. Integrated Humanities, which you might not be surprised is related to the topic of our speaker today, is a new degree program, undergraduate degree in BA or BS, where students do 3 minors instead of a major and a minor, and it emphasizes precisely this type of integration of humanities study and foundation to build on UST's core requirements, which are very solidly based in the humanities. The MLA program is not a new program, but I have launched a new track in the MLA called the Executive MLA for working professionals and lifelong learners who would like to spend time poring over the great books and discussing those in Socratic seminar discussions. I don't know if you were like me, but maybe you didn't pay as much attention as you should have the first time. Or you just missed them, So I do want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, which include the UST Honors Program, the Donald Nesty Center for Faith and Culture, the McNair Center for Free Enterprise and Entrepreneurship, the Office of Dean of Liberal Studies, and the Executive Dean of Arts and Sciences, which brings me to introduce Dr. Harn, who is our Executive Dean of Arts and Sciences, who will elaborate a little bit on what's going on with UST and the humanities these days. Dr. Harn.
All right, can you hear me? Good. On behalf of the university and the School of Arts and Sciences, it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's lecture. It is fitting that we welcome Professor Bonilla to the university for this event. We are a liberal arts university that seeks to form the whole person for flourishing in this life and the next. This entails not only the very best liberal education possible, but also a deep integration of liberal education with professional formation for a life of service to the church and the world in the 21st century. It is also fitting that Professor Bonilla is offering this lecture in the midst of our renewal of the core curriculum. As part of the renewal, there's a kind of ressourcement going on. We're drawing on the thought of Benedict XVI, Pope St. John Paul II, Joseph Pieper, Alistair MacIntyre, Cardinal Newman, and the list goes on. Aquinas, Augustine, Aristotle, Plato. Pretty much anybody who's written on education we're considering and thinking deeply about. By drawing on such a wide variety of authors, though, we're encountering different understandings of human reason and what it means to engage the world rationally. We're encountering a much expanded vision of reason, as opposed to, say, a more instrumental vision, which even Marxist philosophers like Adorno and Horkheimer criticized as being insufficient. Our core curriculum will take up the question as its starting point, what does it mean to be human? Proposing to our students a classical anthropology in which knowledge, however contingent it may be in some forms, is truly possible. We can know things, we can know the truth about reality. And this knowing is broader and deeper than most modern and postmodern conceptions of what it means to know, of rationality. In addition to that question, what does it mean to be human, we're going to take our students through the core, through a variety of other questions. How should I live in order to flourish? What is the relation between faith and reason? Does the light stay on in the refrigerator when I close the door? Indeed, if our core required a motto, it might go something like, from wonder to wisdom. That's what we're seeking to achieve through our core reform. This core will introduce students to an integrated vision of human knowledge in which all aspects of reality can be coherently mapped. If you're familiar with Newman's idea of the circle of disciplines, you'll understand what I mean. The idea that while such a mapping can't necessarily be put in writing or follow, you can't produce a set of rules to make it work out every time. There is this sense in which all of the disciplines belong together. And if you pull one of them out, the others rush in to take their place. And they not only distort the whole, they distort themselves. As a musician, I like to think that music is the hermeneutical key to all of reality. Well, the fact is it's not, right? And so if I try to make it so, I'm going to distort not only music, but other things as well. So these are the questions that are going to animate our renewal of the core, the anthropological question being central, but also questions about purpose, the integration of knowledge, and so on will also be critical. Another aspect of the renewal is an emphasis on the communal nature of this inquiry. We want to get our best students, all of our students, in walking alongside our best faculty as they seek to become wise together. And then ultimately to form our students for life and service in the world. Again, this emphasis on vocation, the idea that cultivating liberal learning in our hearts and our minds is part of our fulfillment of our vocation, but we do it in service to the world. We're preparing ourselves to cultivate the garden of the world. And that's where we're ultimately headed. Our lives are not our own. And so this is very much bound up in how we think about the core as well. So it's fitting that Professor Bonilla is here tonight to speak on this topic. We had a nice lunch today. I learned a lot about him. I wasn't aware that he was a UST graduate. And it sounds like you had quite a successful education here that prepared him for life after UST. He is the international director of the Expanded Reason Institute at the University Francisco de Vitoria in Spain, which is a very interesting institution. I really enjoyed our discussion of that today. This institute is a joint venture with the Vatican Foundation, Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI. He coordinates the Expanded Reason Awards and is director of several projects funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. And we have Professor Sam Kondik here this evening, who recently won one of these awards. So congratulations. Previously, Dr. Bonilla served as Vice President for Academic Affairs at Franciscan University in Ohio. And prior to that, in addition to being a graduate of the university, also served as a professor here at UST. He's a graduate. I guess you said you did a integrated undergraduate. What was your? So he did the liberal arts undergraduate with a minor in philosophy. That's right. I encourage you to take a look at the program that Professor Baer mentioned earlier, look more deeply into that, and consider enrolling. It's going to be an excellent program for professionals. So I ask you, please offer Professor Bonilla a warm welcome.
Thank you, and good evening to all of you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for. Is that better? Good. So thank you to the organizing organizations, the sponsoring organizations, and the University of St. Thomas. I'm really happy to be back after a long time. Thank you, Dr. Harn, for your introduction, and especially Dr. Baer for organizing all of these. This is a great opportunity for me and a great pleasure. I help direct the Expanded Reason Awards, which, as Dr. Harn said, is a joint venture with the Vatican. So I can't start without first congratulating Dr. Samuel Kondik and his sister. Dr. Samuel Kondik is the endowed chair of business ethics at the university, the Cameron School of Business here at the University of St. Thomas, and his sister is a professor of neurology and anatomy at the University of Utah School of Medicine. So they both won the 2020 Expanded Reason Awards, which I'll explain a little bit more at the end if I have time. By the way, I better remember that I have to stop. The title of my talk is The Urgent importance of liberal arts in business and professional and scientific work. I would, we have a short time only, so I can't explore this question very much in depth, but I'd like to say a few words about why are the liberal arts urgently needed or important in the work of professional, business, and scientific life. The way I like to ground this question is on some of the thoughts of Pope Benedict that inspires the work that we do at the Expanded Reason Institute, and motivate and energize the Expanded Reason Awards. But I don't want to do this in a very academic fashion. We could do that, and I'll do a little bit of that, but mostly I'd like to think in terms of why any of us in professional life, personally, being interested in the need of the liberal arts, the humanities in our professional life. I think this is important because the culture wars we're facing today in the United States, in sometimes dramatic fashion lately, and but also in Europe, have make it all the more clear that something is happening. And Pope Benedict expressed that years ago when he addressed in a number of occasions the need for recognizing the importance of this cultural situation we're in. Pope John Paul II said a number of times, I remember once in 1982, he spoke about saying that the crisis of our times was a crisis of meaning. And I think that what we face today, and I don't mean just the problems that we've had in the US with the election or the pandemic and all these things that we know so much about and we hear so much about, but those are symptoms of, I think, that bring out this crisis of meaning. In the infamous, for the wrong reason, but a really important lecture in Regensburg, Pope Benedict spoke about the need to engage the question of truth and how reason involves not just the empirical question of facts and fact-finding and the scientific approach, but how reason should be wider than what we see today in the culture. So that engagement that he encourages us to do is one that I like to think and reflect a little bit in the very practical approach that a student thinking about college, for example, someone thinking about this program that Dr. Baer just suggested, the fact that the University of St. Thomas has a very strong commitment to the liberal arts. Why would a student of any age, not just a high school graduate, but even someone later on that says, I should go back to school, why would a person like that think in terms of a liberal arts education as an important facet? Of course, when finishing high school, the culture today and the emphasis today on employment often turns a university, not this one as much as what we hear today has shown, but many universities, and I travel around between Europe and the United States a great deal, sometimes also in Latin America, and I think that universities tend to be interested in promoting for their recruitment the employability of their students. How well will you do? How much will you earn after you graduate, and so on? They're questions that are oriented towards a career in a professional field or in the science. And those questions emerge because many times students are worried primarily about these things. When you're already in the workplace, you may be asking questions about how to get a promotion, what usefulness would have to do a degree in a master's degree, for example, to move ahead in your career. Those are all fine and important questions. Of course, they're practical questions that we all need to address at some point. And in the university like this one, St. Thomas would certainly be very interested in promoting that. But there's a much deeper question, because I think the pandemic makes it, or has made it clear to us that that we have a crisis of meaning that is profound and real. The elevated increase, the great increase in suicide rates in the United States, to a little lesser extent, but also present in Europe, the suicide rates increase in the last 12 or 18 months shows that what we have is a crisis, a real crisis. Pope Benedict said in his Regensburg lecture that if cultures lose the roots of what gave rise to them, then they cease to be as the civilization that they could have been. The question of human flourishing, Dr. Horn referred to earlier. What is human flourishing, and how do we seek happiness? Today is a very difficult question. In the materialism that has become endemic in first world countries, creates the idea that, of course, making more money or buying more things would bring me happiness. Of course, the marketing world is oriented in structure in the way that it tries to convince you every time you turn the TV on or listen to the radio, or every time there's a commercial, which is of course constant now, to tell you that happiness comes through purchasing things, to buying things, go on a cruise, fly to another country, buy something, change, get a new car every year, get something new, always with the idea that in some way will fulfill you. And that fulfillment is oriented towards your own self-satisfaction. Pope Benedict speaks, and Pope John Paul II, Pope Francis now, remind us that the question of human fulfillment is not just a question of material well-being. And they would insist that this is not just a question about a religious question. It's not a question about being more Catholic. It's a question that is true for everybody, regardless of faith or creed, or even no faith. Because the question of human flourishing, when understood properly, is not just a question of human satisfaction, but it's a question of excellence and the pursuit of excellence in a much more profound way that grounds who I am and informs the high school student that is looking for a career or wondering what he or she might study, as well as a mid-career person that says, I'm not really satisfied. The lack of satisfaction that we experience is true for everybody at some point. St. Augustine speaks of these. We are always dissatisfied at some level. And the question that we have is an invitation to explore why. Why is it that we have today a crisis of meaning? And I would invite us to think in terms of why is it that we have today a crisis in perhaps our own lives, personally, in some way, maybe not dramatically. We're not thinking of suicide, but we know that there's something wrong in our lives at some point. And what I think would be extremely helpful for all of us is to not ignore that question, but to engage it in a more proactive way. And here is where the liberal arts play a crucial role. The engagement in my professional life, in my scientific work, if I do that, or for those of us who are in education, and so education, especially in elementary school and secondary school, can be very challenging, extremely challenging, because it seems that it's a constantly an underappreciated engagement and our own students don't really sometimes appreciate it. They don't know the benefit that they're getting, but we hope to see it. The fact that those things, that level of dissatisfaction may be present or projected at us is an invitation that, like Pope Benedict would say, invites us to think deeper about the meaning of who we are, about the reality of why we are here and what we can do to deepen that. And the liberal arts, but in particular philosophy, provides an opportunity to engage that question in a much deeper level. The United States, especially, you have between Europe and the United States, of course, the United States is the most, the fruit of the Protestant Reformation. And Europe, in some ways, remains the fruit of Catholic Europe. That's what, of course, the founding fathers eventually, came to the United States, primarily because of that, trying to avoid the imposition of monarchy and papacy. And that led to a sense of freedom that became very individual. The separation, the question of sola scriptura, leads to an aspect of understanding of human person in a very individual kind of mentality. Brad Gregory, in his book, The Unintended Reformation, explains this at great length. Pope Benedict, in his Regensburg lecture, makes a little bit of reference to that, and is just a brief reference to something that he developed in a much greater length in a book that he wrote 40 years before that, where he speaks about the nature of the person understood not as a mere individual, but as a part of a created community, a community that finds its bearing within the Bible and finds its meaning through a question about the human person through Greek philosophy. So in it, he speaks about the need to recognize who we are as individuals is the merging of two major cultures, the God of the Bible and the Greek philosophy, that engage in the question about who we are. The study of the liberal arts enables us, especially through philosophy, to ask the question about our own meaning, not just in the abstractive intellectual manner, but in a way that grounds my sense of existence. The Greeks were not just asking questions to ask questions. They were sincerely concerned about, one, whether the Greek gods actually existed or not. Many of the philosophers, of course, knew that the Greek pantheon was fictional, but many of the people in Greece didn't. They built all these altars and so on. It was a very important thing for them, but it was an important question. And the Greek philosophers wanted to ask the question whether the gods existed or not. Because, and for us, that question is a really crucial question, even if Pope Benedict would say, even if you're an atheist, the question, or rather he would say, if you're an agnostic, because an atheist, he would say, is a difficult question, it's a difficult position to hold intellectually. But the agnostic one is a valid one. But that question is a really important question to define who I am. Am I just a collection of molecules brought together by endless chain reaction of molecular biochemistry? Or am I created with dignity and meaning? And that question is what grounds and should ground the question of everybody to define and understand who we are. Why are we here? The work that a university ought to do and tries to do, and what University of St. Thomas seeks to do every day, is to ground the meaning of the professional jobs that we're training students to do, with a deeper, more profound sense of who we are and why we are doing what we do. So what does it mean to be a chemist or a biologist? What does it mean to be a business person? What does it mean to study history or to teach in a school? Why do we do this? Just because you like to work with children or because you like math? Is that what you do it? Or do we do it for a much more profound meaning about what it means to be human within a community? The Catholic understanding of community, of course, derives from the Jewish understanding, and it grounds the meaning of the human person. The Catholic ethos, the Catholic culture, grounds the meaning of the person through belonging in the Christian community. I am baptized into the community sometimes as a baby, because as in the Jewish community, you're seen belonging to the church in the fact that you're born into this family, and therefore you're brought into the church early on, most often. Because the meaning that we receive as Catholics comes through the church. So I am a Catholic by the grace that flows through the church, through the community. The church is a community of believers. The ecclesia to theou, as they say, is the Greek phrases. That means that the meaning that I find as a person is grounded deeply into the community within which I belong. If the meaning that I find as a person just flows entirely from me individually, then I'm a lot less connected to other people. Don't need to be as connected to other people. And if that grounding ceases to be a religious experience, as is happening increasingly in our culture now, where not only do we have a movement towards creating individualism, but it's also an individualism that is more and more secular, then that grounding becomes purely me. Disconnected from a community, or just connected because of social need, but not much more, and disconnected from a meaning that grounds me to a spiritual reality. I'm thoroughly a secular person. At that point, I am not much more than a collection of molecules. That creates a great deal of problems, of course, not just the individualism in the culture, but also the fragmentation we see in politics, oftentimes oriented towards the good of individual groups competing viciously against each other. And in the work that I do professionally or scientifically, oftentimes, and this is not necessarily a problem, mind you, it often leads to a very high level of specialization. Universities are the sense of universitas, the sense of a university in what grounds a university is the existence of multiple fields of knowledge being sought and pursued together as a community that, as professors, seek the truth in their own fields in some way together. And as we specialize more and more, that connection sometimes is lost with the faculty. So among you in the faculty, you often notice that many of our professors, and we don't know exactly what the colleague is doing in another department because it's not in my field. But if we had an awareness, a more active awareness of the fact that my belonging to this community is not an accident of just my having this job, but that I really belong in this group, and my relationship to colleagues, even in another school, in other departments, demands in some ways my awareness of the fact, not that I have to know everything because that would be impossible, but that I have to have a disposition towards my colleagues that would give a great deal of meaning to what we do in university, and it gives a great deal of meaning to what we would do professionally. If I have an awareness of that belonging to a community, oriented, as Pope Benedict would say, grounded in this sense of where do we come from? What is the meaning, this profound meaning that only through study of philosophy, well-grounded and sometimes theology, can give, and hence the liberal arts. Only when we have that do we have a real sense of why we belong as a community and we ought to work as a society well together. And then we can, at that point, overcome in some fashion the individualism, the fragmentation in politics, so that we can understand that the work in politics ought to be for the common good, understand what is the common good. And then recognize that the high specialization that we have in many fields, while in some ways good, ought to in some ways be connected to other fields, and realize that many of the great ideas that have emerged even in technology and science happened because of that interaction with others in other fields. I like to now then explain a little bit of why, in this context, the Expanded Reason Awards are important to the work that we do at the Expanded Reason Institute. And the Vatican Foundation was founded by Pope Benedict, not to promote himself, but to promote what he was teaching, when he had been teaching for 40 years or so. And it's a lot of what I was speaking about today, the sense that what he said, it would say that the importance of broadening the horizon of reason, that reason should not be narrowed to one specific aspect. It should not be a question of positivistic mentalities or an empiricist approach to human life and work, but that it should be broad in the sense that human reason ought to embrace the whole person. And to embrace the whole person, that requires in many ways the embrace of an understanding of philosophy, theology, engaged with particular fields. So when we started the Expanded Reason Awards, the idea was to engage professors outside of philosophy and theology to engage with philosophy and theology. And what we did was to invite professors to ask 4 key questions in their professional work. The reason we excluded the theologians and the philosophers is because the foundation already has a famous award called the Ratzinger Award, which goes mostly to them. But the other fields of knowledge were basically not being addressed, and Pope Benedict was very interested in engaging them, people in computer science, in architecture, in astronomy, in any field of knowledge. So we began these awards, which awards 25,000 euro for 4 winners, so 100,000 euro a year, to people who do research or teaching projects. The next round of winners are about to be announced in the next few days. We just had the meeting last week, of the international jury that selects the winners, and they are selected because they are particularly great examples of the engagement between a particular field with deep questions of philosophy. And we are particularly interested in 4 questions that ought, we think, ground all fields of knowledge, and also the practice of that field. So even for you, for example, out there in whatever job you may hold, the questions are important. These are the 4 questions. What does it mean to be human? What is my definition of the human person in my field of knowledge? This is not an abstractive question. This is for what I do. If I'm a biologist, is the human person a collection of molecules alone, or is it a person with dignity? It changes dramatically the way I would approach biology. It doesn't necessarily, and it shouldn't eliminate the scientific rigor, but it would allow me to approach, in a sense, life differently. So what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human in the teaching of law? many times in our fields of knowledge, we go straight for the field. I just study the law. I don't ask questions about the human person. I just go to the law. We invite people to ask, what does it mean to teach the law? What does it mean to be human in the teaching of law, or in the practice of law, or in the subject of one as a recipient of the acts of law, or any field of knowledge? So what does it mean to be human in your field of study? That's the first question. The second question is, what does it mean to seek the truth? Every science, by definition, is a search for answers, and therefore, ultimately, a search for the truth. So how is that understood in your field? When you seek a question about engineering or architecture, what is truth, and in some ways beauty or goodness in that? And the invitation is to look not in the abstractive way about truth, as in the answer to a mathematical problem, but to ask in terms of the first question: what does it mean to be human in this field? And then the third question, and we encourage people to think in that order, not to start with the third question, which is the one that most typically people would go after. That is the ethical question. What is the ethical question? How do I practice law ethically? How do I practice business ethically? We say that's a great question, particularly if you start with the first two first. What does it mean to be human in business? What does it mean to seek the truth? And then what does it mean to be human? So in law, you would say, what does it mean to be ethical in relationship to a person that deserves the truth? And these questions we encourage them to be very concretely answered from within the particular field that one engages in. The fourth question, and the last one, is the question of meaning. Now, there could be other questions, like the question of beauty, but we use these four questions. So what is the question of, the question of meaning is that question that opens up to the theological answer. Why am I here? Why do I do what I do? Why is this here for me? The four questions enable us to understand our particular fields of knowledge in a much deeper way. It often requires an engagement with philosophical thinking, and provide a richness, not just for a philosophical approach to my work, but in some ways enrich the work itself. And what we do with the Expanded Resonance Awards is we offer these awards to people who in some way are accomplishing these. They are participants from around the world. It's open to every country in the world. We receive hundreds of applicants every year. And if you're a professor and might be interested in this, the application process opens in October usually. Up until this year, it was a yearly process. We've decided to do it every 2 years because there are other projects that we want to do with the winners of the awards and with participants of the awards that which we haven't had time to do because we move from one year to the next too quickly. And our goal is not to just give the awards. Our goal is to create a network of people that understand this and that can nurture this culture within universities around the world. So beginning this year, we'll start doing it every 2 years. Because we see this as an important event in the creation of a network, an international network of scholars that understand these questions. And of course, with hundreds of applicants every year, it's great. I think that the University of St. Thomas has a winner. But more than anything, we hope that they are an encouragement for others around the world to help to do and to seek to do much of what the University of St. Thomas seeks to do. That is to engage the liberal arts. We hope this engagement is an engagement that is deeply rooted in the fields of knowledge. That's a really difficult challenge if you're a faculty member, especially those outside of of philosophy and theology, but even in philosophy and theology, you realize that that's a really difficult challenge to integrate that level of thought within a field itself. But I encourage you to think in terms of the work that all of us do at any level, in anything that you do, whether you're a university professor, a high school or elementary school teacher, or if you're out in the field doing something else, to think profoundly and deeply as much as you can about the need to engage these questions. And if you would, as most of us would, realize that the engagement cannot be and should not be done only by yourself, then here's the University of St. Thomas, as there are many other universities, where you have faculty members that would be, I'm sure, more than happy to engage those questions. So, thank you.
Well, this is a common morning question. Somebody observing that Aquinas says that happiness may be found in our lives through virtue. And the writer mentions the virtues of compassion, kindness, and love. Okay. Any questions? Yeah. No go.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know, when you're thinking about the work that you do in the four questions, how important is knowing the history about what you're doing? Would you say? That is a history professor up there too. And you know, the reason I'm asking is that I work as I work in sales and biotech. You know, first thing that came to my mind when I got a position as a salesman was death of a salesman. You know, death was the first thing. But I took consolation in learning a little bit about the history of the field, the specific biomedical field that I was in. You know, so I wanted to see what y'all thought about that.
I would say that is this. Oh, he's controlling it. That's why. I would say that the history of the field is very helpful, of course. The history of who you are is far more important, right? I had a conversation not long ago with someone who told me that he's studying psychology and philosophy at an important university in Texas, but he decided to not this one, not as important as now, not this one. He decided not to skip the history part. He wanted to do modern philosophy and so on. And so I asked him a few questions, and it became clear to me that he was deeply engaged in a relativistic mess of ideas where he was coming to his own conclusions because he had no grounding. There was no grounding to what he was saying, not because what he was saying was not intelligent. He was very intelligent and had studied the subject fairly well, but had no historical background. So he had skipped a lot of what really would have anchored him. And I think that's very important.
Okay, thank you. I think the question of history in any discipline is a way to reconnect with the larger field of liberal arts. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're an accountant and your practice is very much concerned with auditing or whatever, if you're a public accountant or a corporate accountant, and that's pretty time consuming. But the minute you turn to, say, the history of accounting, and everything has a history, if you turn to the history of accounting, now you're in the realm of the liberal arts. All right? So, and is that beneficial? It's not just an antiquarian exercise, but learning the history of your field can also shed light on current problems or current, why do we do what we do today? And I know accountants, their standards change every year in accord with, among other things, the IRS. So, so to know that history and contextualize what you do could actually make you a better accountant through that reconnect with the liberal arts. The title of the lecture that we had up there, the liberal arts and professions in business and science, the liberal arts, among the most important thing it does is contextualize everything that you do. So a business as a practice or a profession, if you're a physician or a dentist or an attorney, those are all practices. Any practice can take on a life of its own to the detriment of the human person. Or you could, it's one strain of knowledge. The liberal arts constantly want you and ask you to connect what you do to some larger context. So, it's a very, Pope Francis said this in his unique way of speaking, is that someone who is too specialized is dangerous because they see the world only through one discipline. So the liberal arts are this constant reminder to contextualize so that no field of knowledge has a monopoly on the truth, but has a piece of the truth. And that's what I think, at St. Thomas, and it used to be the case, many of you probably went through an education like this. When you went to college, your first degree was liberal arts to give you a foundation, and then you specialized in medicine. The professions have sort of, practical disciplines have crept backwards to take more and more of that time that was dedicated to liberal arts.
Another question.
Oh, you will? Okay, that's fine. So first of all, Dominic, when you talked about the history of accounting, I'm thinking, I'm just laughing because I'm thinking in the back of my head that it was the Italians that actually invented double entry bookkeeping. And when I learned that, all of a sudden, so many things just made so much more sense, right? It explains so much. But I wanted to ask with Max, talking about the 4 questions that the expanded reason awards, this is really for everyone, but the 4th question is the question of meaning. And this is something that Dr. Clint Brand, who teaches English here, has sort of put me onto indirectly, is the question of the moral imagination. And it's just one of these things that I think everybody is very familiar with, but very few people have actually, at least as far as I can tell, have written extensively on it. Russell Kirk wrote something on it. Michael Matheson Miller has done something recently on it. And then one tantalizing little line in an obscure reference that only Clint Brand would know in C.S. Lewis, where Lewis remarks that he says, look, the intellect is the organ of truth, but the imagination is the organ of meaning. Okay, that the imagination is the organ of meaning. And so I want to just kind of bring this around to the whole question of liberal arts education and well, expanded reason as well. But the liberal arts is, what do you think of this whole, this whole sort of Lewis idea that, look, it's through the, that if we're trying to get in contact with meaning, meaning is something that ultimately is what? Our reaction to the world. When we say this means something, this is because we're making a claim about how we have responded or interacted with the world, right? At least to a certain extent. And then the imagination plays a role in this, in giving us what? Archetypes or iconic types for that response. And I don't know, this is just a question I've been mulling over. I find this a very fascinating question. It comes up in business ethics a lot. How do I teach people to be ethical in business? And so much of it is well, if you're familiar with business literature, a lot of it is just, like a classic business book is just aphorisms. Some CEO will write a book and it's all these little vignettes, these little stories that are just communicating little vignettes of meaning about the world, and they're not expanded. They're sort of the business version of pensées, right? But anyway, just sort of an open question about the whole role of the imagination in meaning and in our search for meaning, and the subjective component of this that seems to be there.
Taking your point, I think that Dr. Horn should probably address it. Remember when he was speaking, he spoke about the phrase from wonder to wisdom. That seems to be right along those lines, no?
So I think what I was hinting at in the introduction before I came on was this idea that in the classical view of the human person, there's a much wider range of activity that might fall under the life of the mind, if you will. There is, strictly speaking, a kind of ratio, a kind of reason that is calculative, analytical. But the imagination, the fantasia, is very much a part of the internal, it's an internal sense. It's one of those activities of the mind that takes what we've experienced in reality and reconstitutes it in new and interesting ways. And while all these areas are separable in our reflections, they're very much bound up together in our lived reality. So I think you're onto something that is part of this ressourcement as we try to reclaim an expanded view of reason for our students here at the University of St. Thomas through the core. We're very much engaging not only the calculative, rational, but also the noetic, that intuitive dimension, the imagination. All of that is going to be part of that reintegration of the life of the mind and the core. This question of meaning, I've done a fair amount of work with great book seminars, and there are sort of three questions. What does it say? What does it mean? And is it true? And when we try to explain what you mean by those questions, the what does it mean question has to do with the larger context. It has to do with that, and this ties into the history question, right? So what is its position within the larger scope of time? If an essential part of liberal learning is to think in terms of purpose and nature, you also think in terms of parts to each other and parts to a whole. And in a sense, history is the parts in relation to the whole over time. And that's also part of what the imagination does, is it gathers things in interesting ways and shines light on them. So I think it's very much, I don't think these are antithetical in any way. I think the moral imagination is part of that larger setting of the intellectual life. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, your reference to C.S. Lewis made me think of his, let's say, argument against the modern tendency to rationalize and quantify our encounter with reality. That our imagination as an essential part of the human psychology, how we think and act, it's not genetic, right? Our imagination has to be trained, Lewis would say, ordered to the reality that pre-exists it, right? To the what is, because we can imagine anything. And I think maybe we do a lot of that these days. Utopias, that never were, and, et cetera, et cetera. So the imagination is crucial, but this is how the role of the liberal arts function in the training of our imagination, with the encounter of the human experiment over, eons. Like history is like the great laboratory. We can't do lab rat experiences, but in history we can see how people thinking and acting in certain ways, developed for good or for ill. So yeah, I'm a big fan of history. I have, speaking of history, a question that came in online from Harley. It says, are the fractures in today's society unique to this time? And if not, what are some other instances in history?
Well, I just taught my final class on my seminar on Dante. And so we're just fresh from the crisis that formed Dante's imagination in writing the Divine Comedy in his city of Florence, and then it was replicated in all the northern Italian cities. And it was important there. They were just not, backwaters. They were at the center of the growing commerce that Europe was enjoying. And so Dante is constantly frustrated by the internecine battles in these small cities between a party that was loyal to the Pope or to the Emperor, and so that's one instance. But there are many other instances. The 30 Years' War, the things that gave rise to the 30 Years' War. So this is part of the human condition. Dante was trying to say, is there a way, is there an ordering of society that can not alleviate but diminish or mollify some of these conflicts? There will always be factions, as Madison said, but how do you arrange a society so that those factions don't become destructive of the society? What we're seeing today, this is Madison's nightmare, what we're experiencing today. So the divisiveness to a great degree or a lesser degree is always been there in history.
Trying to think of a time when there was no division. It's the Europe spent most of the Middle Ages fighting some war at some point. I think the question is not whether there are divisions. There are always divisions. The question is, these divisions, how damaging are they? Because civilizations come and go because this fragmentation becomes so damaging to the point that, an empire will collapse. Countries don't last forever, but the end of a country, of a nation, is a very damaging experience for those who live through it. So there will always be divisions, and there will always be. It's a human condition. But but we live in a time, and I think in some ways a privileged time that we don't appreciate all the time, always, is where we can at some point, at least in the West, ask these questions and have the opportunity to try to do something about it, to try to contribute to overcoming these divisions without not necessarily explicit violence, but the violence that is psychological or that is sometimes as damaging as physical violence. Our job should be that in the process of seeking meaning for us, we understand meaning for the other in front of us. And in that way, appreciate that there are sometimes dramatic differences from us, which often causes these tensions. When my neighbor doesn't think like I do, and I'm convinced that I'm the right one, right? Don't we always think that we're the right ones? Or most often we think that, when you're angry with somebody, you're angry because the other person. if we have the humility to recognize that one, we could be wrong, and two, that the other person deserves the same level of respect as I want to have for me and for my freedom. If I want my freedom to be respected, then I ought to have the possibility of respecting the freedom of another. And when we stop imposing or seeking to impose that by force of argument or sometimes by force, our view on another, then these divisions become less problematic. And if we had this understanding of the human person that I was speaking earlier, and what Pope Benedict insists on are, and really, all these recent papers have been trying to invite us to, is to understand the human person as profoundly deserving respect, no matter what the other person believes. Then that changes the disposition we have towards them, and then these divisions would be a lot less harmful. Oh.
I recently read a book. The title is, I think I get it right, it's What It Means to Be Human, A Case for the Public Bioethics by Carter Snead. If y'all have read that, I'd welcome your comments and thoughts about it. It's specifically about the law and even what's the likelihood of American law changing in line of a connectedness instead of the individual.
It's a great book, a very, very important book, and a very needed book. The recognition that we are not ideologies moving around, that this is an embodied reality that we are in, that as such we are in relationship with another. I think it's a thoroughly important concept that becomes less and less relevant as the culture becomes less and less interested in many of the things that have grounded us. For example, the transhumanist mentality that says that the body is an obstacle to you fails to take into account the recognition that the human person is fully human with the body, and that is in that the bioethical question ought to be recognized by governments and states as something that is important for all of us. If we abandon that which is important, thinking just in ideas, in abstractions of what the future might be, that leads to serious problems. And Carter Snead argues that that recognizing the importance of the body, not as an individualistic sense, like you say, but in a community, is ought not to be forgotten. And I think that in many ways the arguments that we make about and are popular today about various concepts of the human person, the human body, and so on, fail to take into account the fact that who we are is, not something that's going to change very much. But we have this view that a relativistic view that says I am who I want to be, or who I decide I want to be. But it's I tell my students that may work as an exercise of imagination, but the fact is you still have to eat well and exercise, or else you'll suffer the same as everybody else do. There's no choice about eating. You can't drink gasoline just because you want more energy. That's not optional. It doesn't matter how you think about who you are and what you can do. It's not an option to any of us to say, I need a power drink, I'm going to drink a glass of gasoline. No, that would kill you. And just as there are, and Pope John Paul II used to argue that just as there were realities in the body that made us who we are, that applied not just to physical reality, in his theology of the body, he speaks about the male and female and the differences, and the not only unavoidable differences, but important differences that are part of who we are. He would say that there's also a psychological difference that makes a complementarity necessary in a spiritual level. Carter Snead argues that all of that needs to be taken into account, that we can't just assume that the body of law and the approach to bioethics can be abstracted from who we are in reality, in our embodied reality.
I'll just add that we were talking about this at lunch briefly, and this is, I think, an incredibly important book. Not surprisingly, for someone who's trying to help renew a core rooted in the question of what it means to be human, this book was very important in my thinking. Chapter 2 is particularly important because of its analysis of expressive individualism, which is at the root of all of these so many problems. And the idea that if you get the human person wrong, a lot of bad things follow from that. If you get it right, a lot of really good things follow. And I think this question of history, in fact, I thought of this when you asked your question, understanding the history of these bioethical issues is very, very helpful, because it helps clarify the importance of these decisions, and also suggest paths that might be possible going forward and some that might be closed to us. But I think what he does is, by critiquing expressive individualism and then proposing an alternative, an embodied alternative, that gives us a foundation to reimagine possible policy changes in these areas. So I think it's a very accessible book, and I think it's a very important book.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Starlick Williams. Let me just say thank you so much for this awesome talk and lecture tonight. It's so refreshing to see and hear that there are other allies within the liberal arts community. I received my Bachelor of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies, recent graduate of the Master's Liberal Arts Program under the direction of Dr. Burr, recent UST graduate. I'm also currently a doctoral candidate in our awesome Doctor of Education and Ethical Leadership under the leadership of Dr. Brandon Green here. So this is so refreshing. My actual dissertation topic is the benefits of your liberal arts education. So this is so cool to hear this. One thing that stuck out to me in your speech was the sense of community that you talked about. And for me, I think it's so vital that we have these cross collaborations between the departments within our own schools and universities. And if we start there to create a true sense of community, then we can branch out ultimately into the community within the city that the university resides. So my question to you all is, how do we start those collaborations within the communities, within the departments here on campus? I'll never forget, as an MLA student, I received an email, and it was from the drama department. And they were reaching out asking for playwrights or people who wrote poems or different things of that nature. And as a liberal arts student, I'm a creative myself. So I'm thinking, wow, wouldn't that have been simple to just like send Dr. Burr an email, and he could have shot that out to all of the liberal arts people, and they would have been flooded and had so many options that they would have been overwhelmed. But something like as simple as that never happened. So as you were speaking, like, this department doesn't know what this department is doing. This faculty member walks by this faculty member and has no clue of what's going on. And supposedly the same sense of community, we're from the same community, yet we have no idea what we're doing. So how do we start those conversations and make change in that area?
I suggest that that is not as simple as it may seem. It takes constant work. Nurturing that community, I think what it should be is a nurturing of a friendship. You want to create a friendship among the various members of the faculty or whatever community you're in. A little story about me. I used to work here 20 years ago, or a little more than that. But I didn't work here on the main campus. I worked at the School of Theology, which is about 25, 30 minutes away on West Houston. Located at St. Mary's Seminary. And one of the things that they would do is they would send emails for activities and so on. And I noticed that, you know, we lived this kind of separate world experience. You know, we were at the School of Theology, and the main campus was somewhat distant in our community. We were very busy doing things. You know, we had to write our papers and teach our classes and so on. But Dr. Froelich had this little practice. And I used to engage here fairly as often as I could. But I noticed one day I was passing by, and he and his colleagues in the biology department were having, they would get together on Friday afternoon, I think, every week, and just sit down and visit. And they kindly invited me to join. I didn't come very often because I didn't have time to do that. But I found that to be a really great experience, to get to know others. And it's a simple effort. It takes work. You have to make the effort. You have to write your articles. You have to grade your papers, teach your class. But to make that effort to come out and visit and just nurture this friendship, it really changes a lot of things. It opens up opportunities for collaboration that you perhaps wouldn't have otherwise. It takes work, though. You remember that?
You know, I think we are very fortunate to have some refreshments outside in the lobby and an opportunity to continue conversations. Please don't run away. And we'll see you in the lobby. I want to thank Dr. Bonilla very much for his talk today. Dr. Harn, Dr. Aquila for chiming in so kindly. And, I hope perhaps if you found this discussion interesting, that you'll look for our next presentation of this sort on the importance of liberal arts and, related questions. I felt particularly moved by Harley's question about the fractures in society today. And I think, for good reason, young people are very concerned. I mean, it really seems like, the world's going to hell. But that's one of the values of liberal education is through literature, through history, through scientific researches, that we get a fuller picture of who we are as a species. Right. And begin to give us an understanding of, what commitments I need to make as an individual and, where I'm going to draw those sources. Right. And if you're not drawing them from some community, some tradition, good luck. Right. There was a very interesting essay by Cornel West about the importance of the classics for civil rights movements today. So thank you very much for attending, and we will see you next time.